Hi guys, welcome back. Now we're going to be starting with monopoly, and just like a perfect competition, we studied that perfect competition is completely one end of the spectrum. Monopoly, guys, is the other end of the spectrum. That is, you can say the opposite end of the spectrum, completely opposite end, or on the other end of the spectrum, if we're studying monopoly being a firm that is the only firm in the market, or some a firm that is the industry itself with zero competition. So basically, but first, when we start off or kick off what monopoly is, we need to also understand that just like when we discussed perfect competition, we were making some very strong assumptions about perfect competition, which rarely existed in the realistic world. And similarly, when we are making certain assumptions of the monopoly model, these assumptions, especially when we are concerned with pure monopolies, as pure monopoly being the only firm in the industry, definitely there are certain assumptions that we will be making that will sort of seem unrealistic. Because saying that there's only one firm in the market with no other firms in the market is somewhat, I mean, obviously we are assuming that there's the entry in the market is basically blocked. I mean, firms are not allowed to enter. So this is a strong assumption, and with technological advancements being made and how digitization and technology has disrupted the industries, blocking someone to enter is sort of difficult now. So this is something that you can write under evaluation of sort of monopoly structure. But then why do we make these assumptions? Because economists do make these assumptions, because when we're studying models, we are making assumptions because we need to simplify our analysis, and these assumptions are made in order to make a comparative analysis. But then, yes, these models do give us, certain useful, important insights into different decisions that firms could possibly make that could impact different economic agents and economic variables in the economy and the society as a whole. So let's kick off with monopoly. So monopoly is, a monopoly firm is a firm, and we're talking about the monopoly, first of all, calling it at I wouldn't be wrong calling it the opposite extreme end from perfect competition. But monopoly basically occurs when there is one firm that is itself called the monopolist or a monopoly firm. It is producing an entire industry's output. So instead of now, you need to understand that certain things are things that are explained in the context of understanding a topic versus things that are from an examination perspective, things that are written in the exam. So there's a difference between comprehending something, understanding something, versus writing it in the actual exam, because marks are given on the basis of what you have written, not what you know, right? Because the examiner is not in your head. So better way to describe a monopoly is that a monopoly is when there's one firm that is producing the entire industry's output, right? And if we and sort of it's good that you sort of compare the monopoly at the very beginning with the start of perfect competition. And remember that monopolies are more compared with perfect competition because they are both on extreme ends of the spectrum. So in contrast to perfect competitive firms, obviously because they are price takers, a monopolist is basically someone which sets the market price. Now the reason why we are writing this at the very beginning is because we are sort of setting the precedence of a monopoly, because making them sound like the sort of the king of the market, because or wearing a crown on their head, right? Because you're saying that they're producing, number one, they're producing the industry's entire output, the entire industry's output. So if there is one firm and that one firm is producing the entire industry's output, then the firm is the industry itself and the industry is the firm itself, right? So we are sort of making it feel to the examiner that how big of a thing monopoly is. So the monopolist will basically monopolist बोलेंगे आप, right? Monopoly firm के बजाय, not every time you'll write the firm monopoly firm, but monopolist will sets the market price. यानी market में जो price है, the monopolist is going to set that. So you see, and like I said, since the monopoly is the firm and since the firm is the industry and the industry is the firm, so the demand for the good in the entire market is the demand for the individual firm's output. Remember, we studied that in perfect competition, where the industry's demand curve was downward sloping, while the demand for where the demand curve, the average revenue curve being the demand curve for an individual firm was horizontal, right? Because it was so insignificant. That there was the contribution to the overall sort of industry's market output was insignificant of a single firm to the contribution to the total industry's output. But that's not the case but that is not the case as far as the monopoly is concerned, because the demand for the good, what we are trying to explain to you is over here that the demand for the good in the entire market, यानी industry का जो demand curve होगा वही demand curve individual firm का होगा, of the individual firm's output. So the industry's demand curve would be the demand curve for the individual monopolist firm, right? So the demand for the good in the entire market is the demand for the individual firm's output, right? So you need to understand, like I said, there's a difference between understanding a topic, comprehending it, versus what you need to write in the exam. Now, guys, when we are saying now let's come to the actual part, and that is when we are saying that monopoly is a one seller that is dominating the market. So, जब आप ये तो बहुत ही, this is something that everyone writes in the exam, that monopoly is a seller or a firm dominating the market. But you need to be very specific. What do you mean by market dominance? When you're talking about market dominance, you're saying that it is producing the entire industry's output, and then it is sort of setting the price. And then the third thing that you're saying is that a demand for the good is the entire in the market is the industry's demand as well, is the demand for the individual firm's output, is actually the industry's demand is the demand for the individual firm's output as well. So ये जब आप dominance की बात कर रहे हैं, you're talking about the market power, so you need to be specific about how that market power translates into or transcends itself into, or sort of manifest itself into what dimensions. So one seller dominating the market is divided into two. So when you're saying that there's one seller dominating the market, that market dominance is in fact divided into two areas. I mean, two types basically. One is a more theoretical way of explaining what monopoly is, less realistic. Less practically likely to exist. You won't sort of see such firms that there's only, maybe you will find a few, but the assumptions that this this structure will make would be less realistic, more theoretical, and that is the case of a pure monopoly. The case of a pure monopoly, which is obviously one theoretical extreme of the spectrum, where you're saying that there is only one firm that has 100% market share because the one firm itself is the entire industry, right? So that is what a pure monopoly is. So pure monopoly is less realistic, more of a theoretical extreme. So when you're talking about monopoly, there are two ways of explaining a monopoly. One is a pure monopoly, which is more theoretical, less realistic, while the other is a more realistic way of looking at a monopoly. That is, we are saying that there are other firms as well in the market, but then there is one firm that is dominating that market in terms of having monopoly power. So when you're saying that the firm is dominant and has monopoly power, it is not the entire firm in the industry, and that firm is not the industry itself. There are a few other firms in the industry, or there might be other firms in the industry, but then that one firm has market dominance, it has market power, it has monopoly power. Do we have any scale or standard to judge which firm would have monopoly power and dominance? Yes, there is. And we say that when one firm on its own has more than 25% control of the market, so whenever a firm has more than 25% market share, it is also a monopoly, but such a monopoly is known as legal monopoly. Legal in the sense that the law calls it a monopoly, and according to the Monopoly and the Merger Commission in the UK, remember that it defines it by saying that there is any one firm or any group of firms, okay? If they produce more than 25% of the total market output, then they are known as a monopoly, dominating the market. They have market dominance, and then in that case they are known as legal monopoly, right? So you need to understand monopoly in these two contexts as well. Now, because the monopoly firm, and देखें ये बहुत important है because when you're attempting a question on monopoly in past papers, then as far as the assessment objective one of knowledge and understanding is concerned, you need to sort of give as a knowledge in terms of what monopoly is. So when you're talking about what monopoly is, that doesn't only include the definition, but it includes the characteristics, the assumptions. It also includes the fact that, when you're saying that the monopoly firm is the only firm in the industry, then what does it really means that the monopoly firm is the only firm in the industry? Now, what does it really means? This is what it actually means, that there is no distinction. If that firm is the only firm in the industry, then there is no distinction between the market demand curve and the demand curve facing a single firm, as there was in perfect competition, where the industry's demand curve under perfect competition was downward sloping versus the demand curve for an individual firm under perfect competition being a horizontal straight line. So thus the monopoly firm is actually facing a negatively sloping market demand curve. And obviously it's a price maker, it sets its own price. So, but then the fact that it's a negatively sloped market demand curve that represents the monopoly firm, then the monopoly firm has to make a trade-off. And the trade-off is that in order to increase output, it has to reduce price, because obviously the monopoly's demand curve is governed by the law of demand, right? Now, one thing is that this is something that the fact that monopoly firm will have a downward sloping demand curve and a downward sloping average revenue curve, because average revenue is a demand curve. This is something that you're not hearing for the first time. You have heard this before as well under revenue, when we're talking about revenue under imperfect markets. Remember that? Because technically monopoly is also an imperfect market, because it's not perfect. Then definitely in that sense monopoly is an imperfect market as well. So, and over there, when I explained under theory of supply, that is about the revenue under imperfect markets, I clearly remember that I sort of gave the example of a monopoly, where I sort of introduce you guys to how the revenue curves are downward sloping, how the average revenue is downward sloping, how the demand is, and why the average revenue is the demand curve, and how they are downward sloping, and how marginal revenue and why marginal revenue is downward sloping as well. So one interesting thing that just clicked right now is that I was reading the other day that why basically. And I wanted to share that knowledge with you guys as well, that why monopoly is called a monopoly. And it's sort of quite interesting, because the word monopoly is sort of a combination of two words. So monopoly is basically mono and then poly. So mono, by the way, now don't write this in the exam, this is for your own knowledge to make it more interesting. Mono refers to means single. So mono means single, and poly basically means control. So now you can make sense of, why monopoly is called a monopoly, and why the characteristic of a monopoly, why do they resonate, why do the characteristics resonate with this word monopoly. So like I said, we have already done those revenue curves. So, and this is something that you guys are not hearing for the first time, that the demand curve for a monopoly is downward sloping. Why it is, we've already covered that as well, and I'll be explaining this later on down in this video as well. One of the another characteristics of a monopoly, or a key feature of a monopoly, is that the products of a monopoly are differentiated and they are unique. That is, they are non-homogeneous, unlike in perfect competition where the products were homogeneous, they were similar, but here they are not similar. Secondly, the monopoly firm is a price maker. It sets its own price, and the reason why it is a price maker is because there's no difference between the firm and the industry. Unlike perfect competition, perfectly competitive firms were at the mercy of the industry's price. Remember, in fact, I mentioned this line 2-3 times while talking about in perfect competition as well. The individual firm in perfect competition was at the mercy of the industry's price. But the monopoly is the industry itself. The firm is the industry itself. So what the firm says is what the industry says. What the firm decides is what the industry decides. What the firm produces is what the industry produces. What the firm sets the price, that is the price set by the industry. So that is why jab a price maker, when you write price maker in the exam, you need to explain what it means. So you need to explain why you are saying it's a price maker, because the reason being that there's no difference between the firm and the industry, because monopolists have full control over the supply of commodities, and they have full control over the market power to, sort of set the price. And if you sort of relate it with the cross elasticity of demand, you know what the cross elasticity of demand is. You've already covered that in AS as well. So you see, if there was a monopoly, if there were to be a monopoly, and the XCD, between the cross elasticity of demand between the product of the monopolist, or the output of the monopolist, and the product of any other seller. So either it must be zero ka boga, obviously, when there's only one firm in the industry, when you have a pure monopoly. Or even if you have even if you have monopoly in more realistic sense, being a legal monopoly, where there are other firms, but one of the firm is a monopolist having more than 25% market power. So in that case, even then, the XCD of the good that the monopoly is producing versus the good that the price of the good that the other firms are producing. So if you calculate the XCD of the good that the monopoly firm is producing, and if you want to calculate that elasticity, the cross elasticity between the demand of the monopolist firm's good versus the price of the other firms in the industry, changes in the price of the other firms in the industry, so that XCD value, the coefficient, would be quite small, right? Indicating that either the monopoly has no close substitutes, indicating that there are less close substitutes, or no close substitutes, in fact. So again, the fact that the monopolist, ये जरूर लिख कर, you need to write this line, the monopolist demand is the market demand. Is ये key distinguishing factor है between one end of the spectrum versus the other end of the spectrum. Where on one end of the spectrum, under perfect competition, you were saying that the industry's demand curve is downward sloping versus the firm's demand curve is horizontal. ये बहुत बड़ा difference है कि you calling an industry's demand curve as downward sloping versus the individual firm's demand curve is horizontal. Because what you are technically trying to point out here is that the individual firm is insignificant to what the industry's output is versus the firm's output being insignificant to the industry's output. But here you're saying that's not the case, so you need to make it sound like that if that's not the case as well, right? That what you sound like should be reflected in what you're writing, not what's in your head, right? Otherwise, the examiner will write in your answer, the examiner will mark or use the acronym not developed. ND stands for not developed. So pure monopoly is obviously a no substitute situation, and the firm is the industry itself. So basically, another key feature is that there's difficulty of entry of new firms and exit. And it simply means that entry is in fact blocked by monopolies. Because so when you're talking about entry is difficult, because it means that either it's completely blocked or it is very difficult, right? Because there are restrictions, there are barriers that monopolies will implement, which are known as barriers to entry, and some of those barriers are natural barriers, that they exist naturally, and we'll study those barriers, while some are artificial, that they don't exist naturally, but the monopoly is going to impose them to make sure that no one enters, so that it can sustain or retain its market power. So which means simply, and iska fayda kya hai? If you complete the sentence, what it means is that if there are these entry barriers, then it means that the monopoly firm if they're making supernormal profits, then they will continue making those supernormal profits. And like in perfect competition, where supernormal profits were being made in the short run, but then that entry of new firms in the long run wiped out those supernormal profits, and ultimately firms are only making normal profits. But that is not going to happen in the short run versus the long run under the monopoly, where the monopoly will continue making those supernormal profits in the long run as well. Another characteristics of monopoly markets is that there is imperfect information of market conditions. Remember that, imperfect information about price, quality, output, and which is also one of the reasons why an efficient price. And so if you could say that, why is that entry? So it's not only the entry barriers that restricts firms from entering the industry, the imposed by monopolies. It's also the fact that there's imperfect information. The price signals are not working properly because remember जब हमने price signals की बात की थी, the price signals and the price mechanism that modeled Adam Smith views, we were assuming that the markets are perfectly competitive, and the reason we were assuming that was because under monopolies we are saying that there's imperfect information of market conditions. The price mechanism or the price signals will not efficiently and effectively incentivize, neither signal out key information to come in or enter the industry, right? And that is also one of the reasons why firms will not enter such monopoly markets. And then there's imperfect information for the buyers as well. They also have imperfect information. Another thing is that monopoly, again, the objective of monopoly is to maximize profits. They're profit maximizers. That's what we are saying, or what we are assuming, and they will produce where marginal revenue equals to marginal cost. That is the same monopoly, the same profit maximizing rule that is using the marginal approach. And monopolies will discriminate. They will price discriminate. हम पढ़ेंगे monopoly के बाद का topic would be price discrimination, where we study the first, second, and third degree price discrimination. Again, a key topic under monopoly. Interesting topic as well. And then the fact that price discrimination is simply charging different prices to different consumers, and we'll study when we are going to be studying price discrimination. We're going to study properly in depth what it actually means, not the topic for now. And like I said, ये बात पहले भी मैंने आपको बताया कि short run situation, long run situation under a monopoly is not going to be different. If you're making abnormal profits in the short run, you will continue making those abnormal profits in the long run as well, simply because of entry barriers. As far as the cost and the revenues are concerned, the cost curves for monopoly are exactly the same. देखिए cost curves जो होते हैं, when you're saying how will the monopolies fixed cost look like, how will the monopolies variable cost look like, or average cost look like, or average fixed cost look like, or average variable cost look like, or average total cost look like, it's going to look like the same for every firm, because the cost curves are not governed by the market structures. So the shape of the cost curve would be the same for all the market structures because they will be the same for all the firms. So the monopoly will face the same short-run, long-run cost curves, the same short-run average cost curve, the same long-run average cost curve as other market structures will face, right? Because, and we know that which short-run cost curves, they are the result of law of diminishing returns. So law of diminishing returns will happen in the monopoly as well, just like it was happening in any other firm. Because law of diminishing return is not dependent upon which structure of the market you are in, market structure, right? And long-run cost curves are shaped because of returns to scale, and that are applicable to monopoly the same way as they are applicable to other market structures. So the cost curves, remember that they have nothing linked with what, the market structure. They have nothing to do with the market structures. Now, as far as revenue is concerned, मैंने यहाँ पे reference भी आपको दिया है, this reference of video 20. So before, I would suggest that if you have already watched video 20 theory of supply, just go through the notes again, because I'm assuming that you guys are making those notes. So the video 20 of theory of supply, make sure that you sort of go through those notes, and if you haven't properly made those notes and review the video again, ideally you should be making those notes properly. So the revenue curves under a monopoly, us video mein, under video 20 of the theory of supply that is on Google Classroom, that video, the revenue that was explained in that video, the average revenue, the marginal revenue, the demand, the link between price and demand, the link between why average revenue is called the demand curve, the fact that marginal revenue is twice as steep, or everything that was explained in that video is applicable for a monopoly. That will be exactly applicable for oligopolies as well. That will be exactly applicable for monopolistic competition as well, because अभी जो मैं आपको repeat कर रहा हूँ, because this is what I'm saying right now, and then I will not repeat this point in the next market structures I'll do, that the video 20 revenues, because those revenues are for imperfect markets, and monopolistic competition in oligopolies are imperfect markets as well. A lot of textbooks don't call monopoly being an imperfect market, because the simple reason is because they want to place monopoly, especially the unrealistic part, simply on the other end of the spectrum. And because monopoly is an imperfect market, but sort of a complete extreme end of the spectrum. Well, a more realistic, practically what we are seeing around is that practically we are seeing more monopolistic competition and oligopolies to exist, and that is exactly why they are labeling them as imperfect markets, while they sort of label perfect competition and monopolies on the totally other extremes. But then, just because the economics textbooks are not calling, some of them are, but if they're not calling a monopoly as an imperfect market, doesn't mean that the monopoly market is not imperfect. It is definitely imperfect. In fact, it is the most extreme form of an imperfect market, right? Completely on the other end of the spectrum. सो वो रेवेन्यू की वीडियो जो है वो तमाम मार्केट स्ट्रक्चर्स में एक्सेप्ट फॉर परफेक्ट कंपटीशन एप्लीकेबल है. सो एवरेज, बिकॉज परफेक्टली कंपेरेटिव फर्म्स हैव डिफरेंट रेवेन्यू कर्व्स, वो भी हम डिस्कस कर चुके हैं. सो एवरेज रेवेन्यू कर्व अगेन डाउनवर्ड स्लोपिंग होगा. एवरेज रेवेन्यू विल ऑलवेज बी इक्वल टू प्राइस. एवरेज रेवेन्यू इज ऑल्सो द डिमांड कर्व. ये सब चीज़ें वीडियो में डिस्कस हुई थी. उसी वीडियो में हमने ये भी डिस्कस किया था, जस्ट रिकैप, दैट in order to increase the sales, the monopoly must reduce the price, because the demand curve follows the law of demand for a monopoly. So the price will go down definitely in order to increase the sales, and that is why the demand curve, and this is the reason why the demand curve and the average revenue curve is negatively sloped, downward sloping hota hai. And because, and the reason, and jahan pe humne baat ki thi, if the monopoly firm is reducing the price, we also discussed that in that video, that when the monopoly is reducing the price, it is not only lowering or reducing the price on the additional units it is actually selling, or the marginal extra units that it is selling, but it is also reducing the price on all the previous units it is selling. And usko phir humne represent kiya tha through a gain in marginal revenue versus the loss of marginal revenue. एंड जो हमारा नेट इफेक्ट आ रहा था वो यही आ रहा था कि मार्जिनल रेवेन्यू वाज डिक्लाइनिंग ट्वाइस एज स्टीप एज द डिक्लाइन इन एवरेज रेवेन्यू, एंड वी प्रूव दैट मैथमेटिकली, न्यूमेरिकली एज वेल. Numerically, in fact, through numbers, I sort of explained you. I remember the chocolate bars example that I was giving. So the one thing is for sure: the MR is less than price. The MR is less than AR. At every level of output it is selling. So the average revenue, the marginal revenue, this is the average revenue curve, and this is your marginal revenue curve. Then your marginal revenue curve for let's say this level of output, for let's say Q1. If this is your marginal revenue, it always has to be less than your average revenue. This is the value of your marginal revenue. Well, this is the value of your average revenue, because the vertical axis is the value axis, the pound or the dollar axis, that is the value axis. So basically, but then marginal revenue is also twice as steep, not just it's not only less than AR, it's twice as less than AR, right? So as you sell more and more, your average revenue falls, but your marginal revenue is it's falling twice as fast as your average revenue is falling. And also we studied that demand curve, marginal revenue curve भी downward sloping होता है. It starts from the same intercept as the average revenue starts, but then marginal revenue becomes zero, and then it becomes negative. So it's going to be, the marginal revenue will be positive over the range when your demand curve is elastic, because we studied that the elasticity of demand is sort of different along your demand curve, and I explained why. Uski bhi explanation aapko di thi, and hence your total revenue would be rising on that case. So marginal revenue will be positive, total revenue will be rising, and when your demand is inelastic and the monopoly is reducing price to increase output, because that it has to do that, then your total revenue is going to fall when more units will be sold, and in that area where the demand is inelastic, marginal revenue will be negative, and MR will be zero over the range of output when demand is inelastic, and in that case total revenue would be maximum, and MR falls twice as steep. तो ये सारी चीज़ें हमने cover कर ली थी. I was just a very small recap and introductory video on perfect competition. Now what is coming ahead? आपको बताता हूँ. I'm going to be ending the video here, but what is coming ahead of you? So basically we're going to be discussing the short run. In the next video we will be discussing the abnormal profits, the area of abnormal profits being made. उसके वही diagrams होंगे abnormal profit के areas के जो हमने perfect competition में पढ़े हैं, तो more or less जल्दी से wrap up हो जाएगा. And then the long run equilibrium, then we need to study, the pros and cons of a monopoly, whether it is efficient or not, what sort of efficiency it brings in, what sort of inefficiency it brings in, and then the comparison with perfect competition, and then the deadweight loss of monopoly, and that sort of interesting things. It shouldn't take. It's not going to be difficult, because a lot of the diagram conceptually you are already aware of. So yeah, wait for my next video, and then I'll see you there in that video. Until then, take care.